Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Attention Span Labs. Today we're going to be talking about a great playset from my youth and probably a decade or more before my youth that was re-released, and the little toy soldiers that got me into wargaming. I'm going to try to do this video impromptu. It's the true test of every YouTube personality that they can run at the mouth for a long period of time without a script in front of them. So we'll see how that goes. I will hopefully not make too many mistakes and not require too much editing. But if you see any cats flying by, if the chandelier suddenly comes crashing down, then I apologize in advance. Anyway, what you see before you is the Navarone Mountain playset by Marx. That's the toy company, not the communist. I don't know when this was originally released. I think in the 1970s or even the 1960s. There's problem one of a live recording. Anyway, I actually got this in the early 90s when it was re-released. I got it at Toy Works. If anybody remembers Toy Works, let me know in the comments. That was a spin-off of KB. KB Toys. You probably don't know what KB Toys is either. Anyway, I got this in the early 90s. It was re-released. And I'm not sure how closely it's based on the movie or the book of the movie or the movie of the book, The Guns of Navarone. But basically, it's a big plastic mountain with this version has looks like anti-aircraft guns on it. The original version I remember seeing in an ad from an old comic book that I have on DVD. I think had like large anti-ship guns. I don't know, 5-inch guns or something like that. But anyway, this is, as you can see, it's a pretty impressive mountain fortress. You've got the gray plastic buttresses, supposed to be steel and concrete extending. You have up at the very top, a machine gun nest, pillbox. At the bottom, you can see behind some of the tanks I have there's a garage door for vehicles to come out, and then a larger man-sized door. And then if you look closely, you can see some light poking through it. You can also see, I guess they're machine gun slits. And I can turn this around and show you the other side, although there's not much to look at. I don't still have all the pieces for this. There was an elevator. There were some planks on the inside that all the little army men could stand on. But this was originally released with the 54 millimeter chunky green plastic army men, the kind that people normally think of when they think of the little army men that actually aren't so little. But when I got this, I was big into collecting at the time 1/72nd scale miniature army men. 1/72nd scale translates, so that is for they're basically 72 times smaller than the real thing. So if you theoretically stacked 72 of them up, they would be the height of a man. That translates about to 25 millimeter. If you're familiar with wargaming conventions, 25 millimeter is used to be the most common. For all I know, it still is. And it's great because it's a small enough size that you can get some detail on the figurines, but you can also get a lot of vehicles for it. And you can actually see some of these. I'm going to try and pan the camera down slightly. Some of these in front of it. There's a Rocco, I think 1/72nd scale M1A1 Abrams tank with the cannon broken off, painted in the chocolate chip pattern. Next to it, there's a 1/72nd scale T-55. I'll talk a bit more about those in a minute, but at the time, you have to imagine this was the early 90s. I was 1993, I was 10 or so. And a couple years before that, Operation Desert Storm happened, and it was all on TV. It was very exciting. I know that sounds bad, but it was very exciting to someone who was not there, who was not being bombed or being shot at. But it was all on CNN, and At the time, I was 7 or 8 years old. Very interesting to watch. I was very much into the military at the time. Grew up playing with GI Joes, and my dad read a lot of books about that sort of thing, and I learned about the different tanks and airplanes and so forth. And I was always very much into that. And at that period of time, I forget who, maybe Revell or Monogram, I don't know, they're probably the same company. Someone released a set of 1/72nd scale modern U.S. Army action, or not action figures, but the 1/72nd scale miniatures. And I got them at the local train store. And I also got a set of Vietnam era figures. They were painted bright green. The modern ones were painted in desert tan because this was right after Desert Storm. I also had a set of Soviet Spetsnaz troopers, and then they were light gray, molded light gray, and then Viet Cong to go along with the U.S. Vietnam troopers. They said U.S. Vietnam troopers were like a bright green, and the Viet Cong were like a very drab brown green. And that is completely irrelevant to this video. But anyway, they're pretty small, and smaller than the theoretically 28 millimeter Warhammer miniatures that are already hard enough to paint. But they're actually more like 30 or even 32 millimeter. But they're big enough that you can paint them, and I did very very poorly. My dad said, "Oh, these are too small to paint. You can't paint them. You can't paint details on them." And that's not actually true. I know as an adult now, I could do it, and I have done it before. I've mostly gotten rid of my 25 millimeter collection in favor of 15 millimeters, which you can also see some on the table here. But I painted them basically by painting their guns black, and I painted the really, what I thought was really cool looking chocolate chip pattern, which you can actually see on the M1 Abrams here. I'm going to zoom in on it so you can take a look at it. So this is the that Roco M1A1 Abrams tank, which theoretically is in 1/72nd scale, or it's pretty close. So it's probably closer to like 1/84th or something like that. It's probably more like 20 millimeter versus 1/72nd, 25 millimeter. But I painted the figures like this as well. If you remember the early desert camo chocolate chip pattern. I don't know what it's officially called. Called it chocolate chip. This is a I don't know, a 10-year-old's version of that. But anyway, so I had a lot of vehicles like that. I had a couple M901 Hammerheads, which was M113 with a tow missile launcher on it. I had the M113 itself. Some vehicles like that. And I just collected a lot of the little figures, and I would play with them in the sandbox outside, or just on the carpet. They're hard to stand up on the carpet, if you know what I mean. They had little bases on them like this. This is actually a Micro Machine Star Wars figure, if I can zoom in on that correctly. He's a Star Wars Hoth Trooper from the Micro Machine Action Fleet line. They're not true 25 millimeter. And zoom back in there. They're not true. They're probably closer to 20, but they're good enough. But that's good enough for comparison in scale. So I had a lot of those, and I would play with them. And by play with them, I mean how a kid normally plays with toys. I'd go pew pew pew, and knock them over, things like that. And over time, I began to collect some more sets, including play sets. I had Ertl made these die-cast models of tanks. I have a M901 Paladin self-propelled gun. I had a many aircraft, F-16s, F-18s, and they had a large airfield that lit up the little lights on the runway. That had little LEDs and had a tower. I bought some model sets with trenches in, some air-fixed D-Day sets, like German shore emplacements with coastal guns. And with that, I started getting 1/72nd scale figures from all areas. World War II, British SAS, the German Wehrmacht, and so forth. And I would sometimes paint them, mostly not though, and I would just play with them. And then I got this big playset, Navarone, which is just a really cool, very impressive looking thing. And you can, as I said, it came with a larger 54 millimeter figures, but it looks much better with the 25 millimeter. Put him up there. Oops. So you can see it's much more visually impressive, and you could have scores of figures. I especially would play with my friend Russ. I would give him the Germans, and I would have the SAS guys, which had little boats, and they had two-man teams with ropes with grapnels on them, and have them ascending to the side of the mountain. And after just playing with them the way kids normally play with toys, with pure imagination and the "I shot you" and this guy died and so forth, I began to get into the idea that there could be an actual a game played with this. I didn't necessarily have any idea with rules or dice or anything like that, but I began to think of some informal rules where I would choose one man to fire, and then whoever I was playing with, Russ or my grandfather or something, would choose another man to fire. And you could knock over one guy, and then you could advance and so forth. And if someone had a sufficiently heavy weapon like a bazooka or a Dragon anti-tank missile, maybe you could disable the tank. And that was really the beginnings of what I would call my interest in wargaming. It's a far cry from any sophisticated wargaming system. It's even a far cry from the very earliest H.G. Wells' Little Wars idea, where there were more formal rules, and you actually had to fire a cannon to knock over troops, and that you actually had to have a bit of a good aim on that. You couldn't just reach across the table and flick them with your finger. People who don't know what I'm talking about, by the way, H.G. Wells, who wrote War of the Worlds and a lot of other stuff, The Time Machine. Anyway, he was into wargaming, and he wrote this book called Little Wars, which was basically a game he played with painted lead miniatures on the floor. It was a gentleman's game at the time, wasn't a kid's game, and you fire little spring-loaded cannons, I guess. I don't know if they were spring-loaded. You might have flicked them. I don't think they were carbide cannons or anything like that. And you would try to knock out the other guy's army, and you would move them a certain number of inches across the battlefield. The battlefield being, your parlor floor. That was around the turn of the 20th century. So anyway, there's your lesson on the origin of non-military war games. So anyway, from there, it wasn't too long before I started to realize that there were actual war games on the market, and I'm not sure what the first one I found was. I think it was Star Wars Miniature Battles by West End Games, which was a spin-off of the Star Wars role-playing game that was very popular in the 80s and 90s, back when people still liked Star Wars. So not like now. And it was great. And it came with a little set of miniatures. It came in a box set at Walden Books. Now, again, I know I'm dating myself. A lot of people watching this video probably don't know what Walden Books is, what it was. But there was a time when there used to be bookstores, more than just Barnes and Noble every so many miles, and more than Amazon. Actually, Amazon didn't even exist yet. But Walden Books, there used to be one in every mall. I hope you know what a shopping mall is. But because there's not too many of those around anymore, I guess. But Walden Books, it was a box set, and it had the rules in it, and I still have those rules. And it came with an assortment of miniatures and dice, and there was conventions that became very familiar to me, with blast templates, the rulers to measure distances, and I really got it, and it completely overwhelmed me. I had no idea how to play it. I guess I was about 11 or 12 at the time, and it completely overwhelmed me. I couldn't really figure it out. My dad set up one of the example scenarios, but we really didn't have enough miniatures to do it. It didn't come with like 2 full platoons of each side, as the mission required, like 2 stormtrooper platoons and 2 rebel platoons. But we made do with what we had, and we sort of muddled through it. But I was in love with it, in theory. I wasn't. I hadn't quite mastered it, and when you're young like that and you have a set of rules, sometimes you read so far and you kind of figure out what you can, and then you just sort of make up the rest of the rules, and that's what we did. And then we eventually, my friends and I started playing Star Wars miniature battles, but with the Star Wars action figures, Power of the Force line, the 1/18th scale, 3 3/4 inch figures. And not too long after that, I convinced my mom to buy me the Warhammer 40,000 second edition box set, which I guess was like 1995. And we got it in the mail through Chips and Bits, which is in the back of the little tabletop role-playing and war game and computer game catalog in the back of like magazine, PC Gamer magazine. Sent away for it. It was expensive, not nearly as expensive as today though, but I got it, and what I really loved about it was the miniatures. And I made my first awful forays of painting miniatures, having no idea how to paint them, no understanding of that you should use acrylics instead of enamels for this. They took forever to dry. They're sticky and like really caked on the paint just for the detail. No idea about washes or anything like that. That was my my first tenuous steps into some of the things I still do now. Those my introduction to Warhammer. Now, Warhammer, I was old enough. I was 12, 13 at the time, and it made more sense to me as I was read the rule book, and I was able to master that rule set. And I taught some of my friends how to play it, and got them into it. My friend Russ in particular, who I'm sure is watching right now. Hi, Russ. But anyway, I actually knew how to use those rules, and we played them accurately, and it was fun, and I still have fond memories of second edition 40K. From there, I got into Necromunda, and eventually a little bit Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Oh, and you know what? That reminds me. I'm actually skipping an important part there. Somewhere in between between buying a set like Navarone and getting into Warhammer, there was a period where I got this game called Battle Masters. And Battle Masters was a huge, I won't call it a tabletop war game, because the mat was so huge you had to play it on the floor. And it was a war game sequel to the role-playing game Hero Quest. And as you probably know, why Hero Quest is so great already. Battle Masters was also great, and it was made by Milton Bradley and Games Workshop, and it was didn't explicitly say so, but it said it was it you could tell from the names of the cities and so forth, and the aesthetic of the units that it was set in Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And I think it came with a little pamphlet, like the introduction to the Games Workshop world of miniatures, and that's where I first found out about Warhammer 40K, and I was more into that than Fantasy Battles. That's where I started. Okay. And I did eventually paint some of the Battle Masters miniatures too, but that was a long time off. And I remember that the Battle Masters were actually painted on the back of the box, and I was really impressed by that. But when I first got it, I was like, oh, I could never do this. So, all right, anyway, that's the story of how I got into wargaming through Little Toy Soldiers. So let's take a look at the Navarone Mountain a little more closely, and I can show you some details. Okay, so here's a close-up of the bottom part of the mountain. As you can see, I've opened the big wooden planked garage door, which admittedly is very much out of scale for 1/72nd scale. The wooden planks are so huge, but whatever. It's good enough for me as a kid. You can see this Soviet T-55 fits in there quite well, and then there's that Star Wars 20mm figure top. So it's quite large. You can imagine this filled with 30, 40 men climbing up the mountainside, getting shot off, having grenades drop down as they're using the scaling lines. It was all very cool. Up here, you can see the anti-aircraft gun I mentioned. It said in the original set, I believe they were larger, single-barreled, guns you might find on ships, 5-inch guns and so forth. And here's the second platform. See, there's a cool little set of steps going up the side, and a little doorway portal in. And there's all kinds of nice ledges on the side as well. And then we have up top the machine gun nest, which when I turn the mountain around, you'll be able to see the platforms that the soldiers could stand on. Okay, here's the back of the mountain. As you can see, it's quite cavernous. You could fit a lot of troops inside, large selection of vehicles, larger than I had, and still have plenty of room. And it kind of, as I'm scrolling up here, it kind of reminds me of from that evil Spectre command center in what was the James Bond movie in Japan? You Only Live Twice. I don't know. I don't remember that one, but they're in the volcano and they're kind of like have to come down level after level, and the guys are like throwing ropes down and fast roping down, where they're getting shot at. That's what this reminds me of now. As you can see the gun slits there, and these little sections are actually the slits were the elevator, which was just like a little box mounted on a little plastic strip, and you moved it up and down because there's no stairs on the inside. And you had to use your imagination to get from the next to the top floor to the very top floor. But yeah, this was a really cool place, and I had a ton of fun with this. And I'd like to hear from anybody in the comments who remembers this playset or maybe has the older one. And I'd like to hear your stories too about how you got into Wargaming, and if you still play with Little Army Men. Now, one final thing before I go. I want to mention that I want to use this set for 15mm gaming at some point in the future. I have a scenario in my alternate history superhero adventure novel series where there's an assault on a rebel compound in Mount Shasta. I know this doesn't look like Mount Shasta, but I think it would be a good stand-in of their fortress. And they have a lot of 15mm minis that I'm going to paint up and use for that purpose. These ones here are, these 15s, if I can zoom in, are Star Grunt, new Israeli power armor commandos. Look a bit like Halo troops. But I have large 15mm troops, large assortment of 15mm troops that I have to paint to do this. But I intend to refight this fictional battle at Mount Shasta, 1979, between the forces of California and the breakaway forces of the Jefferson Republic. And besides the plenty of 15mm vehicles I have, you'll find that this the Hot Wheels Matchbox tanks are a pretty decent representation of a 15mm vehicle. Now, the Matchbox Hot Wheels type cars, they're consistently sized so that, you know, a car is the same size as this tank is the same size as a dump truck, right? But that also means they're out of scale. So the one thing if you're into gaming in any of these scales, generally the cars are suitable for 1/72 scale or 25mm, but the larger things like fire trucks, big rig trucks, cement mixers, front end loaders, bulldozers, and tanks like this are usually suitable for 15 millimeter. And you can actually see this. This is a sort of I don't know how well you can see that in the dark. I probably should shoot this with more light, but that actually has some little men in the back. That's kind of a knockoff representation of an M2 Bradley. This is a very old Hot Wheels too, so I think it's from the 83. Does it say on there? Yep. Anyway, but they're a good source, and also a good source of parts. You can clip pieces off and use them in Gaslands. Of course, you could use them in Gaslands directly, because that's what Gaslands is made for. I don't know how many people actually deploy tanks. I know there are rules for using tanks in Gaslands. I've never actually seen anyone do so, but I have a lot of tanks that I could use for that purpose. And maybe one day I will. Maybe I'll do a Gaslands video if I ever get to play it. I'll give you my thoughts on that as well. Okay, so that wraps up episode 3 of Attention Span Labs. If you like this video, let me know in the comments. Give me a like, thumbs up, reshare it, and subscribe. Also, if you want to support me, I don't have a Patreon or anything like that, but you can support me by buying some of my books. And if you like the things I talk about here, there's a fair chance you'll like what's in the books too. I actually have 6 books out. These are 2 of them. Copper Dancing Granite Man is like a dysfunctional Fantastic Four meets Hammer horror movie, so it's a superhero horror mashup. The Dismal Tide is book 2 of a teen superhero action adventure series. They're all set in that same universe I mentioned with the Mount Shasta battle. All kinds of cool stuff going on. It's an alternate history. And if you're into wargaming and role-playing games, you'll find plenty of stuff in the appendices that will probably pique your interest. So check them out on Amazon. And until next time, this is Mike signing off.